Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Joining me to talk about the reality of Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech and Joseph Stalin's death in 1953 is my friend Paul Kengor, author of numerous books including The Devil and Bella Dodd. And the reason why these two events are so crucial is because March the 5th is the anniversary of these two separate yet profoundly linked events. Paul, I'm so glad you're joining us. How are you?
Marcus, I'm so glad that you're talking about these events. It's one of the things I love about you and your show. I don't know many other people out there anywhere in the country in talk radio or anywhere that's connecting dates like this. I connect them in my lectures, my Cold War lectures, but it's not often that I get called upon to talk about this on a radio show. So thank you for that.
Well, I'm honored to have you on, and I'm frankly surprised not many more people do this. But I'm also an autodidactic student of the life of our nation. I as an immigrant, I believe I owe it to our nation to be that way, and I believe as a citizen that's what we're all called to. So I thank you for drawing these links for all of us to learn from. Let's start with historical background and context. We can begin with Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, the historical background of the speech and what he was trying to achieve.
Yeah. So it was a crucial moment at the start of the Cold War. In fact, Stalin would blame Churchill for starting the Cold War because of this speech. But at that point, it was about a year after Yalta had ended. So Yalta was early February 1945. And at that point, you had Churchill, FDR, Stalin, and they were all trying to get along. It ended up where Eastern Europe was basically sold down the river. Poland and all these other countries behind what would eventually become the Iron Curtain. Now, the first time that phrase, the Iron Curtain, was used was about 1 year after Yalta. And so that would be with Churchill on March 5th, 1946. He comes to the United States. At that point, he's a former prime minister. Now, incredibly, Marcus, they hold an election in July 1945 in Britain. It's the first election that they've held in several years because they suspended elections while the war was going on. And at that point, it's just a formality. Everybody figures, well, of course, Churchill is going to get reelected. But he lost. He lost overwhelmingly to Clement Attlee and the Labor Party. It was kind of like, well, thanks for what you did for us, Winston. We were winning the war and everything. Now get us out of here. We want our literal blueprint for our socialist welfare state, right? National Health Service and everything else that the Attlee administration would do. So Churchill is no longer prime minister. He's invited to the United States by Harry Truman, who succeeded FDR. FDR died in April 1945. And he speaks in Fulton, Missouri, which is not far from the hometown of Harry Truman, Independence, Missouri. And he gives this extraordinary speech where he says, I hate to say all of this on the morrow of a great victory in which we were all allies. But right now, the Soviets are expanding through all these countries of Eastern and Central Europe. And he names the capitals, right? He says Budapest, Bucharest, Warsaw, Sofia, Prague. And he says behind all of them lies this expansionary country, and they are following behind what Churchill in that speech called an Iron Curtain. He said an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent, and he stretches it from up north down south, cutting Europe in half. The response to it, Harry Truman, who would later become a really solid Cold Warrior, was stunned, taken aback by it. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was always a leftist anyway, she said, I can't believe that you would degrade my husband's memory in this way. How dare you? She basically took the side of Stalin and the Soviets' propaganda on it. But it turned out to be absolutely prophetic. Here, and when Winston Churchill at the end of the 20th century was named by a number of Western sources, including at least one American source, as the man of the century, people pointed not only to his role in standing up against the Germans and the Nazis and foreseeing all of that in World War II, but his foresight in recognizing what the Soviets were doing in 1946 and having the courage to say it in the Iron Curtain speech.
Historically, I remember reading he was called an alarmist for the speech, and like you said, Roosevelt's bride criticized him for it. The sad thing is, like you said, it was so prophetic because he was right. Only Anglo-American unity was going to deter the further expansion of the Red Army.
Yeah, and he even said in that speech, he said that Soviet Russia is a threat not only to civilization, but as he put it, to Christian civilization. He actually used the word, Christian civilization, talked about their proselytizing and expansionary tendencies. And he pointed out that, there is basically a Comintern, a Soviet Communist International, which has the goal of spreading communism around the world. And they were now beginning that in earnest right after World War II. And at that point, it took Churchill, somebody with Churchill's moral credibility, to come to America and say that. Now, unfortunately, Eleanor Roosevelt called him a warmonger. Mm-hmm. Stalin called him a warmonger. Like I said, Truman was very nervous. The one guy, Marcus, who kind of bucked him up, he got on a train and he went to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to meet with Dwight Eisenhower, who was his old World War II ally. And he said to him, Ike, do you have anything for me to drink? Right? and Ike said, well, no, I'm like this old Baptist. I don't have any alcohol at all. Right? And he said, well, actually, wait a second. And there was like a flask on the fireplace from like a bottle that somebody had given to him at some banquet as an award for defeating the Nazis or something like that. And Churchill said, let me at it. And Churchill took a swig of that just to calm his nerves because he was so rattled by the harsh criticism that he was getting for, in his view, just simply sounding the alarm about what should have been obvious, that Stalin and the Soviets were starting an aggressive expansionary campaign and were starting a Cold War by lowering an Iron Curtain across the continent.
Tell us about the Berlin blockade, what that did to the West and the civilizational resolve of the West.
Yeah, the Berlin blockade. So that was one of those early moments. If you're going to start the Cold War, I mean, people will say, if you look it up online, maybe in like 1947 to 1989. Some will start it with the Berlin blockade, 1948, and Berlin airlift, 1948-49. I would actually start it with Yalta in February 1945, because that's where the betrayals begin that leads to the descending of the Iron Curtain and the division of the Cold War. And that's where the Cold War really starts. But that was a remarkable action by Stalin, because at that point, Berlin, which had been the wartime capital of Germany under Hitler, it was at Yalta that Germany was divided into West Germany and East Germany. Western Germany being on the western side, the Western Alliance, Eastern Germany being behind the Iron Curtain. But Berlin was actually in East Germany. So we divided Berlin into a West Berlin and East Berlin. West Berlin was free, East Berlin was not free. But there was one road route that went into all of Berlin from Eastern Germany, and Stalin and the Soviets, in complete defiance and violation of the terms of Yalta, blocked it in order to try to starve out Berlin. The response to that by Harry Truman, who was shocked, was, I mean, he had some generals like Lucius Clay and others who were arguing, pushing him to actually ram through the blockade. And he said, no, I don't want to do that because I'll end up killing Soviet soldiers. So instead, what they came up with was the Berlin airlift, where they flied thousands of sorties. Every day, planes would fly over over Eastern German territory, and drop candy, drop supplies, whatever it is that they could bring into West Berlin. But it was a very aggressive action by Stalin, very telling, and one of the first real clear signs that indeed a Cold War was on between the United States and the West and the USSR. And
let's pause there, Paul. The music is hitting. I'm talking with Dr. Paul Kengor, author, professor of Grove City College in Grove City, Pennsylvania, and we're talking about the link between Churchill's Iron Curtain speech and Joseph Stalin's death in 1953. Continuing on the other side. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter. Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Pete. I'm talking with Dr. Paul Kengor, Professor of Political Science at Grove City College in Grove City. And he is also the author of numerous books, many of them my favorites actually. Devil and Bella Dodd, The Devil and Karl Marx, A Pope and a President. You know, actually, Paul, I don't think you've ever written a book that I didn't consider my top favorites.
Oh, that's too kind. Thank you. I appreciate it.
And so we're talking with Paul about March the 5th being the anniversary of two linked events that I think many of us in modernity don't quite think about, and that's Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in 46 and Stalin's death in 53. So, Paul, when we last left off, you were talking to us about the fallout, essentially, of the Iron Curtain speech, but what Stalin was brewing in the background.
Right, and let me throw you a curveball here. You'll be surprised by this. There's a third March 5th date that only kind of Cold War geek like myself would even know about this, right? But on March 5th, 1940, all right, March 5th, 1940, that was the date that Stalin signed the order to execute 22,000 Polish military officers that had been captured and were subsequently murdered in what's known as the Katyn massacre in Poland. And so that happened on March 5th, 1940. You have the Iron Curtain speech on March 5th, 1946. And then I think rather profound, given that Stalin signed this massive death warrant to all these innocent, Polish, by the way, Catholic military men on March 5th, 1940. Stalin on March 5th, 1953 died on that date, on the very same date that he signed that order for the execution of all of those men. So I find that rather profound.
If that's not divine irony, I don't know what is, genuinely.
Right.
Gosh.
Sure.
I mean, talk about the blood on his hands. Let's pick up then. You were just telling us, or at least showing us, how the Berlin blockade, while not really considered the official beginning of the Cold War, we can go all the way back to Yalta for that. At the very least, it presented a very tangible test to the civilization of the West. Tell us about the detonation of the Soviet Union's atomic bomb in 1949, what that signaled to the West.
Yeah, and that was a really big deal, too, because when we first tested the bomb in July 1945 at Alamogordo, which is where Robert Oppenheimer and everybody, Los Alamos, the deserts of New Mexico, that's where they tested the bomb. And at that point, so we had been planning to use the bomb on the Nazis. I mean, that was, the idea was that German scientists had discovered fission and that there was a race for the atomic bomb, and we had to get the bomb before the Germans did. Well, the Germans ended up surrendering in May 1945. And then the bomb was developed a couple months later, and it ended up that we believed, or at least Harry Truman believed, right? This is obviously very controversial in Catholic circles, and Fulton Sheen, among others, criticized it. But I'll just say that Truman determined that he felt that in order to compel the Japanese surrender, that the bomb had to be used on Japan. So it was August 6th and 9th, 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We felt at that point that the Soviets were years away from getting a bomb. But they had spies. They had spies in the U.S. government, and they ended up with information from the Manhattan Project, and they got the bomb 4 years after we did in 1949 in a real shocker. We did not expect that at all. In fact, really, Marcus, the twin shocks of 1949 were that the Soviets got the bomb, and that somehow, inexplicably, to this day, no one can quite figure out how it happened, Mao Zedong and his communist forces in China somehow overtook Chiang Kai-shek and his Kuomintang forces. An unbelievable development there. So those are kind of, the two big shocks of 1949. But when the Soviets got the bomb, that was a game changer. With that, the arms race was on.
That arms race, went on to, quite frankly, reshape the trajectory of where we thought civilization was going at that point. So immediately following Stalin's death, If we jump ahead here, immediately following Stalin's death, we see this power struggle. How did that reshape the trajectory of all of this conflict between the East and the West?
Yeah, no, it was a very remarkable power struggle between, in every case when a Soviet leader died, a Soviet despot, right, tyrant. It wasn't like in the United States where the 25th Amendment to the Constitution kicks in and the vice president comes in and there's a process for succession. No, there was always this bloodbath among the would-be successors. And in the case of Stalin, I mean, it was names like Molotov, Malenkov, Khrushchev eventually gets it in 1956. And the one man that they all feared in the Soviet system, Lavrentiy Beria. Beria was Beria, who was the awful head of the NKVD and the KGB. In fact, when Stalin introduced Beria to the Germans at their banquet after following the Hitler-Stalin Pact, he said, "I'd like you to meet our Himmler," right? My Himmler, Lavrentiy Beria. And Beria was just this odious, awful figure. He was a serial rapist. He would have his chauffeur drive him around Moscow, and his thugs would grab girls, pick him up, and he would take him back. Just a horrible human being. He was so bad and so despicable. And by the way, he actually told Molotov, Beria did, that he took out Stalin. He claimed that he had poisoned Stalin. And so after Stalin's death, the one man that none of those guys wanted to take over was Lavrentiy Beria. They arrested him. They put him on trial. They accused him of, counter-espionage activity, which was the usual charge that they used in communist systems. And they actually executed Beria, so he couldn't take over. So the one who eventually takes over 3 years after the death of Stalin is Nikita Khrushchev.
And Khrushchev was a bloodthirsty individual, and as he emerged dominant in that struggle, he delivered. So in the 56, right, he delivers this secret speech,
right?
And what he does is he denounces Stalin's cult of personality, but then he tries to form one around himself.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, the Crimes of Stalin speech, also known as the Cult of Personality speech, and he really laid into Stalin. By the way, Stalin had first of all, he deserved it, but Stalin had ridiculed Khrushchev, embarrassed him. In one case, he goes up to Khrushchev, and on his bald head, Stalin dabs out his cigar. And Khrushchev is just, gets literally red in the face, and he probably steam coming out of the guy's ears, and maybe literally so at that point and later on, Khrushchev thought, I'm going to get this guy. I'm going to get this guy back. And he did in 1956. And because of that speech, everybody thought, okay, well, there's going to be a thawing in the Cold War. This leads the people of Hungary, when they found out about the speech, because the speech eventually became public. It was leaked. Front page New York Times, others covered it immediately. Because of that speech, the people in Hungary, among other places, had an uprising and said, this is our chance to break away from the Soviet Union, to leave the Iron Curtain, as Churchill called it. But Khrushchev and the Red Army sent in the tanks, house arrest, Cardinal Mindszenty. So Khrushchev made clear that he might go in and he might denounce Stalin and the crimes of Stalin, but he wasn't going to end the Cold War or the Iron Curtain division of Europe.
In 55, we see NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. How did that impact the progression of global events?
That begins right there with a formal military division of the two camps, right? Mm-hmm. So NATO ends up, led by the United States, the UK, Britain, 16 countries initially in NATO. The Warsaw Pact countries were the USSR and about 8 countries in total. So the USSR and then the countries behind the Iron Curtain, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the others. So with that, the two sides are dug in and facing one another, guns and tanks aimed at one another through actual literal military division and military camps.
To go back a few years, following Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, about a year later, Truman puts out what we now remember as the Truman Doctrine, 1947. What did that do to steel the resolve of the U.S. and the rest of the world?
Yeah, that was crucial too. It's one of the areas where the Cold War historians will start with 1947, right, as the year that starts the Cold War, because you have the Truman Doctrine, which is $400 million in aid that goes to Greece and Turkey. And the idea is to keep Greece and Turkey from going communist. The Soviets at that point, they badly wanted a country like Greece, like Turkey, Italy, even Israel. In fact, Stalin initially the Soviets supported recognition of the nation of Israel in 1948 because Israel had such a left-wing, pro-Leninist government. David Ben-Gurion and the Labor Party, they were very far left. So they were hoping that Israel could be an ally, a Soviet ally. But with Truman drew a line with Greece and Turkey, and that aid to Greece and Turkey worked magnificently because they stayed in the Western Alliance, and they even stayed in NATO. And to this day, Turkey is the easternmost country in NATO, the country that's the land bridge going into Asia and into the Middle East. So it's because of the Truman Doctrine that happened and led to Turkey being in NATO and being a crucial ally really to this day.
Paul, this was tremendously beneficial and enlightening. Thank you so much for making the time. I appreciate this.
No, happy to. Anytime, Marcus.
My guest has been Dr. Paul Kengor. He is professor of political science at Grove City College. We've been talking about Churchill's Iron Curtain speech and Stalin's death, both occurring on March the 5th in 2 different years. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.